There is a building in Colombia that shows up on every list of the most haunted places on Earth. It stands on the lip of a cliff southwest of Bogotá, with empty windows and a waterfall roaring past it. The stories attached to it are about ghosts and about the last 100 years. Those are the least interesting thing about that spot, because the people who lived on this plain before anyone built anything told a story about it. They said the whole plain had once been underwater, a flood that covered everything. And they said the water drained away when the mountain was opened at one specific place, the place where that cliff is. The plain really was underwater. We have the sediment, we have the pollen. We know roughly how big the lake was and roughly when the water left. And it left through exactly the gorge the story names. That is the part nobody can comfortably explain. Start above ground with the building, because it is the reason most people ever hear this place exists. It went up in 1923 during the government of Pedro Nello Spina. The architect was Carlos Arturo Tapias, and he built it as a private house in a French style with tall windows facing the water. It was called the Mansion of the Tequendama Falls. Within a few years, it had been enlarged and converted into a hotel, and for a short period it was one of the fashionable addresses in Colombia. Wealthy families came out from Bogotá to look at the waterfall. Then the Great Depression arrived, the money dried up, the expansion plans died, and the river started to turn. The Bogotá River, which feeds the falls, became one of the most polluted rivers in the country. Guests stopped coming to admire a waterfall that had begun to smell. The building closed in the 1990s and stood open to the weather for years. It has since been bought and restored by the Granja Ecologica El Porvenir Foundation, and it now operates as the Museum of Biodiversity and Culture of the Salto del Tequendama. So the ruin is not even a ruin anymore. The waterfall itself drops about 130 meters, at an altitude of roughly 2,400 meters, some 30 kilometers from the center of Bogotá. Its name is not Spanish. Tequendama comes from Chibcha, the language of the Muisca, and it translates roughly as he who precipitated downward. The name describes falling. Hold that for later. Now go below the building to the story. The Muisca account was written down by a Spanish friar named Pedro Simón in his Noticias Historiales, compiled in the 1620s. He was recording what he was told roughly a century after the conquest, which means the version we have came through a colonial filter. That matters, and we'll come back to it. The account is specific in a way that legends usually are not. It names two figures, Chibchacum, a deity associated with the earth and with the people of the plain, becomes angry with the Muisca and punishes them. He does not summon rain, he diverts rivers. Simon names them, the Sopo and the Tibito. Turn toward the central plain, the savanna floods and stays flooded. The people call on Bochica. He appears on a rainbow carrying a staff of gold, and he opens a passage in the mountains at the southwestern edge of the plain. The water finds the opening and pours out. The savanna drains and becomes land people can live on. Notice what kind of story that is. It is not a flood story about rain, and it is not a story about a boat. It is a story about drainage, about a closed basin that filled up and then found an outlet at one edge. The mechanism is hydrological, and it is correct, which brings us underground to the third layer. Bogotá sits on a high plain in the eastern Cordillera, ringed by mountains. Under the modern city and under the farmland around it, there are hundreds of meters of lake sediment, not river sediment. Lake sediment, the fine layered kind that only accumulates in standing water over very long periods. Beginning in the 1960s, a Dutch geologist named Thomas van der Hammen spent decades reconstructing that basin. His teams drilled deep cores. The most famous of them, Funza 2, went down 586 meters, and the pollen preserved in that column let researchers read the climate of the plain back across hundreds of thousands of years. Van der Hammen worked on that record with Henry Hug Heemstra, and the full environmental reconstruction of the basin was published with Vicente Torres and Jeff Vandenberge in 2005. What the cores show is a lake, a very large one. In Van der Hammen's reconstruction around 60,000 years ago, the Bogotá savanna was covered by open water. a body sometimes called Lake Humboldt, spanning something on the order of 4,000 square kilometers. To put that in scale, it would have been many times larger than any lake in Colombia today. And then it went away. As conditions changed and the basin filled, the water found its way out at the southwestern rim, cutting down through the rock and running off toward the Magdalena Valley. The outlet it cut is the gorge of the Bogotá River. The place where it goes over the edge is the Salto del Tequendama. So the legend says the plain was a lake, and the plain was a lake. The legend says the water left through an opening at one particular point on the rim, and it did. The legend even gets the direction right. Now the fourth layer, and this is where the ground under the story gets much older. About 2 kilometers from the falls near Soacha, there is a set of rock shelters, overhangs in the stone, dry, defensible, facing the right way. In the 1970s, the Colombian archaeologist Gonzalo Correal Urrego excavated them, and his findings were published in 1977 by the Biblioteca Banco Popular under a title that says the thing plainly: 12,000 years of the history of man and his environment on the high plain of Bogotá. They found stone tools, they found the bones of animals that no longer live there. They found human remains, and critically, they found them in stacked layers, one above another, which meant the shelters had not been used once. They had been used continuously across an enormous span of time. Radiocarbon work since then has pushed the numbers further and made them sharper. A study published in the journal iScience in December of 2024, led by Michael Ziegler with an international team, ran fresh radiocarbon and stable isotope analysis on humans and fauna from Tequendama and from the nearby site of Aguazuque. Their chronology puts occupation at Tequendama beginning around 13,500 years ago and continuing with interruptions down into the last few thousand years. The same study read the chemistry of the bones for diet. The people at Tequendama ate a wild, forest-based diet across almost the entire sequence. At Aguazuque later, the isotopes show maize arriving around 4,400 to 4,200 years ago. You can watch agriculture appear in the chemistry of somebody's teeth. And here's a detail that's easy to miss. Correal Urrego did not excavate those shelters alone. His co-author on the 1977 publication was Thomas van der Hamen. The same man who reconstructed the lake also dug the shelters at the edge of the gorge that drained it. One researcher, two halves of the same story. So we have a legend that describes a drained lake, a geological record of a drained lake, and 13,000 years of people living 2 kilometers from where it drained. It looks like it closes. It does not, because when you line the dates up, they do not touch. In van der Hamen's reconstruction, the outflow through the Tequendama Gorge, the event that emptied the plain, is placed at roughly 30,000 years ago. The earliest secure human occupation at those shelters is around 13,500 years ago. That is a gap of roughly 17,000 years. Nobody watched it happen. There was no one on that plain to see the water go. By the time the first people set their fires in those shelters, the lake had been gone for longer than the entire span from that moment to now. They arrived to a dry plain, a finished gorge, and a waterfall that had already been fallen for millennia. Whatever the story is, it is not an eyewitness account. It cannot be. And the problem gets worse because there is a second break in the chain, and it is very recent evidence. In May of 2025, a team publishing in Science Advances reported the first ancient human genomes ever recovered from Colombia. They sequenced 21 individuals from 5 sites on the Bogotá Altiplano, spanning roughly 6,000 to 500 years ago. The work came out of the Senckenberg Center for Human Evolution and Paleoenvironment at the University of Tübingen, with Cosimo Post as senior author. What they found was a population nobody knew existed. The pre-ceramic hunter-gatherers of the Altiplano carried a basal lineage, branching off very early from the first peopling of South America, with no close relationship to any other ancient group that has been sequenced. And then that lineage vanishes completely. In individuals from the same region dating to around 2,000 years ago, it is simply not there anymore. It had been replaced by an ancestry associated with Chibchan-speaking populations from Central America, and that new population then stayed put for the following 1,500 years. Sit with what that means for our story. The people who told the flood legend of Pedro Simon in the 1620s were Muisca, and the Muisca are on the Chibchan side of that replacement. Genetically, they are not the descendants of the hunter-gatherers who lived in those rock shelters. So the chain's broken twice, broken by 17,000 years of nobody being there, and broken again by a population turnover that swapped out the people who might, in theory, have been carrying something down. The story's accurate. The people telling it are not descended from anyone who could have seen it, and what it describes finished before humans reached the plain at all. There are 3 explanations on the table. None of them is settled. The first is that it is memory, anyway. This is the field sometimes called geomythology, and it is not fringe. Oral traditions in several parts of the world do appear to preserve real geological events across surprisingly long spans, coastline changes, and volcanic eruptions among them. It explains the precision. It explains why the mechanism in the story is drainage rather than rain. If some human group was in the wider region far earlier than the shelters suggest, and if a version of what they saw was passed down, the match stops being a puzzle. Here's what it does not explain. The distances involved are not comparable to the other cases. The best documented examples of transmitted geological memory run to a handful of millennia. This would need to run to 17,000 years across an occupation gap, and then survive a complete population replacement 2,000 years ago, in which the incoming group would have had to adopt and retain the story of a group they replaced. Every one of those steps is possible. All of them together, with no supporting evidence for any single one, is a lot to carry. The second explanation is that the story is remembering something real, but something much more recent than the lake. Because the savanna did not stop being wet when the lake left. It was a landscape of marsh and shallow water bodies and seasonal flooding, and it stayed that way for thousands of years. The Bogotá River still floods. The lake beds are still there under the soil. The people living on that plain would have experienced water covering the flats and then draining away toward the southwest repeatedly within living memory, every generation. So ask yourself which is more likely, that a story survives 17,000 years intact, or that a story about something people watched happen at a small scale every wet season was told at the largest scale they could imagine and happened to describe the ancient version correctly because it was the same process, run bigger. And ask yourself something harder. If that is what it is it still wrong? The third explanation is the quietest one, and it is the one that has grown on me the most. They worked it out. Stand on that plain without any of our instruments. Here's what is in front of you. The land is flat, unnaturally flat, and it is ringed by mountains on every side, a closed bowl. The soil is fine and layered, and it holds water badly in some places and endlessly in others. There are shells and lake deposits in the ground. There are marshes that never fully drain. And at one point on the rim, and only one, there is a deep notch cut clean through the mountains, with a river running through it and dropping off the edge. Now answer the question that landscape asks. Why is this plain flat, and why is there one hole in the wall around it? There's only one answer that works. It was full, and it emptied there. That is not a myth. That is an inference from physical evidence, which is the same move a geologist makes, arrived at without drills, without radiocarbon, without a single core sample. And when Bochica opens the rock with a staff of gold, that is not a substitute for the explanation. It is the explanation, wearing the clothes that explanations wore at the time. We tend to treat the golden staff as the primitive part of the story. It might be the packaging. The reasoning underneath it is sound, and the conclusion it reaches is correct. And there is one more thing. The name. Tequendama, he who precipitated downward. They did not name that place after its beauty, or after a god, or after a battle. They named it after an action, after something going down and out. So the next time that hotel turns up on a list of haunted buildings, remember what it is standing on? 100 years of ghost stories on top of 13,000 years of continuous occupation, on top of a drowned plain that emptied through the gorge below it 17,000 years, before anyone arrived to wonder why. The building is the newest thing there by an almost absurd margin. And the question the whole place leaves you with is not whether the legend is true, because in every checkable respect, it is. The question is how it got that way. So put yourself there with no instruments and no records. A flat plain, mountains all the way around, old lake mud under your feet, and one gorge cut through the rim with the water going out. What story would you have told? Tell us in the comments, because your answer is the same answer they had to reach. Chrononum, where history meets imagination.